Mishpatim. Mishpatim is the section of the Torah that comes right after the revelation at Sinai. And we're going to begin with that question, in fact, which is right after this gigantic revelation, right after the thunder and the lightning, and the Israelites see the voices, and there's this spiritual synesthesia where all the senses are mixed up, and there's this powerful sense of the disruption in the normal order of the world. Then you get to Mishpatim, which you find in your Chumash, and beginning in chapter 21. And it starts off, "These are the rules you shall follow. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he serves for 6 years. In the 7th year, he goes free." On and on and on and on. In other words, it goes into the minutia of law. And one sec, I have to pause and just plug this in. It goes into the minutia of law. And if you ask yourself, why does it do that? That is, there we go. That is, why would the Torah move from the enormity of these grand spiritual declarations of the 10 Commandments, of the revelation at Sinai, of the peak of human history, and then start talking about boundaries and charging interest and keeping a slave? So that's at least the beginning of the question that we're going to examine. First of all, we should establish that slavery was an institution everywhere in the ancient world. And in some ways, the Exodus story is not exactly an anti-slavery story, as it is a story against human beings ultimately serving other human beings, as opposed to ultimately serving God. But if you wanted to work off a debt in the ancient world, as is clear from the Torah, the way you do it is by servitude. And therefore, how you treat your slave is the question. And the Talmud goes so far as to say that somebody who acquires a Hebrew slave acquires a master because of the care with which you have to treat your slave. But apart from the specifics of the laws, I want to say something about the generality of the law. And this will require a little bit of background that I have mentioned before, but would like to mention again. We tend to think of religion as something that you feel. People will say, I feel religious, or I feel spiritual. Judaism doesn't work that way. In Judaism, religion is how you practice what you feel and how you practice what you are told to do. And part of the reason that is so is the difference between the origins of Judaism and Christianity. Christianity arose in the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, all the civil law was already taken care of. You didn't have to make laws about what happens if you steal something, because the Roman courts took care of that. Therefore, when Christianity arose, the only domain that was open to religion was the internal domain, about how people feel, and maybe some interpersonal conduct, being nice. But the social arrangements, they were Roman social arrangements. They weren't going to be Christian social arrangements. Judaism grew up in the desert. And therefore, civil law, what happens when your ox gores my ox, civil law and religious law were mixed together. And so it's not strange for the Jewish tradition to say that following the revelation at Sinai, we needed the specific laws by which we would live. And that helped shape Judaism's philosophy about Sorry. For a moment, I think I disappeared. At least I disappeared to myself, which is an interesting metaphysical question. But anyway, so in the context of Mishpatim, in the context of our Torah portion, what happens is that laws like economic laws become laws about how you treat one another, how you behave towards the stranger, and all those sorts of things. So let me tell you the story that I, in my Jerusalem Post column today, which I just posted. It's on Facebook and on Twitter. I talk about that when I first came to be a rabbi at Sinai Temple. So I grew up with my father being a rabbi, and I had seen the way he ran his synagogue, sort of, in as much as you pay attention to what your father is doing professionally. I certainly saw him at the synagogue a lot, but I didn't really know how other rabbis ran their synagogues. And I thought I would go on a sort of listening tour. And I invited a bunch of different rabbis at different times to lunch. And my question was, how do you run your synagogue? And I remember one rabbi gave me a long philosophical disquisition about how you create a sacred community and how people treat one another and how they speak about one another and so on. And that's how he runs a synagogue. The second one was about how you teach the children, the adults, about creating a learning community, a community of Torah study, and that was how he ran his synagogue. Then I sat down with a very well-known rabbi, had a very successful career, and I'll never forget his opening words. He said to me, David, it's all about the budget. I don't care what they say they care about. Look what they spend money on. That will tell you what they care about. And what I realized over the years is that they were all correct. That in fact, the values have to be reflected in the specifics. You can say, I'm a very charitable person, but if you don't give charity, you're not. You can say, I care deeply about study, but if you never study, you don't. So, Mishpatim, this section, is the real world consequence of the principles of the last week. It is where the rubber hits the road. It's whether you actually believe what you say. And the best predictor of what it is you care about is what you have done, not what you say. And therefore, Mishpatim asks us to take a look at our actions. If you open a pit and an ox or an ass falls into it, you're responsible. If you strike out the eye of a slave, if an ox gores a man or a woman to death, if you give money or goods to someone else for safekeeping. Now, that's a very practical, everyday regulation. You give me something to keep. What happens if I lose it? What happens if it's stolen? What happens if I don't give it back to you? Those sorts of specifics are essential to running a society. And some of them, like the section, chapter 22, verse 21, also tell you the underlying values of the society. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you afflict them and they cry to me, I will surely hear their cry and my wrath will burn. So there is also this sense that the substructure of the Jewish tradition is one of compassion and of justice, and that justice is the essential foundation on which any successful society must be built, and that those kinds of that kind of justice has to be based on the specifics of the law. Meir Tamari, who is an economist, mentions the fact that there are some 24 regulations about keeping kosher and over 100 economic regulations. And that's because though that's where people interact with one another, and where they show what their value really is to each other, and where they demonstrate if gain distorts their sense of value. It's one of the reasons why when you come before God in Olam Haba, the first question, according to the Talmud, that you're asked is, were you honest in business? Because most people will not commit horrible crimes, but they might cheat on their taxes. They might be dishonest in business. And so the Torah seeks to make us honest and think about honesty in places where we are most inclined to not think about it. Therefore, looking at another section in Mishpatim that is very well known, when it says you shouldn't boil a lamb in its mother's milk. 3 times the Torah talks about this. Clearly, the fundamental regulation is about humanity, right? It's its own mother's milk. How can you boil a lamb in its own mother's milk? Also, there's such a contrast between eating meat and milk, which represents life and sustenance. But the fact that it's mentioned 3 separate times means it's a deeper principle than just that lamb and that milk. And therefore, as you know, a pillar of kashrut is keeping milk and meat separate. So they should not be combined. So the Torah is giving us that message. And it comes down to very specific regulations about how you keep meat and milk separate, because the principle underlying it of remembering that milk is this life-giving thing and meat is something that you have to kill in order to eat, should constantly be before our eyes. Part of the idea of law, that is religious law, is to ensure that we don't sleepwalk through the world, that we are aware of the consequences of our actions, and that they have a shaping effect both on society and also on our own souls. So, okay. Other regulations that are involved in Mishpatim, it talks about the festival of the unleavened bread. It talks about not idolatry. It's a very, very full parsha. It talks about Moses going up to the mountain and the cloud covering him on the mountain. There is a great deal, and then next week is going to be Parshat Truma, where they talk about building the Mishkan, but we will get to that when we get to that. So it is a full parsha. It has lots of important regulations that continue to be central to the Jewish people, but also interspersed with it is a declaration, a statement that reminds you that all these specifics blossom out into general principles. So in chapter 22, verse 30, it says, "V'anshei kodesh tihiyun li," you will be holy people to me, right? The Kotzker Rebbe's somewhat cynical remark about that is when it says, "You shall be holy people to me," it's God has enough angels. God doesn't need you to be an angel. God wants you to be a holy human being. So act with holiness like a person, and that's a wise caution too, to remember our humanity and to act that way. Okay, I've thrown out now a bunch of stuff. It is 9:15, so for the last 15 minutes, I've given you a taste of Mishpatim. Let's see if we have any questions of, thank you, Rena, about sleepwalking through life. Let's see if we have any questions about anything that we talk about. By the way, while we're talking about sleepwalking through life, the Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, the great Hasidic master, said, some people tell stories to put others to sleep. I tell my stories to wake people up, which I always thought was a beautiful comment. And his stories have, in fact, been incredibly important to the Jewish tradition, the Jewish people, for a long time. Okay, so from Jim Freeberg, did a Hebrew slave have a right of redress if he was mistreated? Yes, they did. And to whoever the authority and whoever the authority was at the time, whoever the court was at the time, the nature of the Jewish court at different times is a matter of tremendous historical debate. So the rabbis talk about the Sanhedrin, which is the rabbinic court. Historians debate whether the Sanhedrin actually ever sat the way the rabbis say. And the only honest answer is we don't know. We really don't know. We don't have the evidence of it. But in the Bible itself, we see that that there clearly are punishments prescribed, but we don't know whether those punishments were ever carried out. So, for example, there is a punishment for a Sabbath breaker, which is given in the Torah itself, but in subsequent years, we have no record after the Torah of a Sabbath breaker ever being put to death. So it's very hard to know how the justice system worked in different places at different times, through the judges, the kings, and so on. No, I did not see what Rabbi Greenberg wrote this morning in answer to Guy Handelman. So whether, in what way the courts sat and how they judged, and whether they used the biblical law or they changed it, is also a question. Because remember, when you get to the rabbis, and there is between the close of the Bible and the beginning of the rabbinic period, we have this very shadowy period, shadowy only because we don't have any documents or so on that tell us exactly what went on, of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly. But we don't know what the men of the Great Assembly did or what the Great Assembly was exactly, although there's a lot of speculation. And so we really are missing pieces of our own legal history, and we're not able to reconstruct how that happened until we come to the rabbinic period. And even in the rabbinic period, it is not entirely clear what sovereignty the rabbis had, because for most of the rabbinic period, Jews did not control the land of Israel. They did up until sort of the first, second century BCE. And after that, really, there was an enormous amount of control by the Romans, as there had been previously by the Babylonians. And so with all this disruption, it's very difficult to know how law courts were constituted and how that worked. So anyway, other questions? What about the use of the term Elohim? Okay, so Elohim is an interesting term, which I see that Joey is asking about. Elohim means both judge and God in Hebrew. And so sometimes it's used purely for human judges, and sometimes it's used to refer to the presence of God. And it does not seem as though one necessarily indicates the other. And so when it says that you go to the judges in your time, to the Elohim in your time, it seems like it just means judges. We know from English that sometimes words can have very, very different connotations in different contexts. And whether Elohim in a certain context means judge or God, you have to basically judge by the context, although it seems to be pretty clear most of the time. But it's not the Shoftim is another word for judges, but Elohim is as well. And so it does not seem like when it says that it means anything other than a human judge. What else? There are also, by the way, clearly elders here from Israel. Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel ascended and saw the God of Israel. And under his feet there was a likeness of the pavement of sapphire, like the very sky for purity. So not only are there elders, that was, by the way, chapter 24, verse 9. Not only are there elders, but they have some kind of vision of God. Now, once again, I don't think the Torah intends us to take this literally. This is how it appears to them, just as the prophets have visions. And the vision of a prophet of God or the vision of an elder of God is not identical with the actual vision of God. It is true that if you read the Bible alone, sometimes it seems as though God is visible, but clearly that is not the theology that Judaism has derived from the Bible. And there are more statements of God's, of one being unable to see God, or even that one can't live if one sees God. And yet you do have these very elaborate images where people see God. And what I would say is that they see in some sense that we don't understand or exactly comprehend, some magnificence that is something of the presence of God beyond the imagination of somebody who cannot see it. And so, and today laws are basically, I mean, apart from the land of Israel, where laws are civil laws, there are lots of different rabbis and rabbinic bodies that make laws for their constituents and groups. Those of you that joined us a couple of weeks ago with Judith Hauptman know that she's on the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, and for the conservative movement, that is the committee that gives guidance on all sorts of different questions in Jewish law. Everything from electricity on Shabbat to marriage, to kashrut. I mean, for questions of things that are of questionable kashrut, and there are still obviously things that we're debating about, even on the margins of whether something is kosher or not. All those sorts of things, at least in the conservative movement, is the Jewish Law and Standards. And then in the Orthodox movement, there are some bodies that do that, but then there are also certain poskim, certain legal deciders whose authority is considerable, and they're the ones that people follow for this. But those are the major points that I wanted to make this morning. The only other issue that I think is worth exploring for a couple of minutes before we wrap it up today, and next week we'll have a much longer discussion about the Mishkan and the idea of God's dwelling among the people, that metaphysical idea. The only other thing that I would say is that this also is, mishpat means justice or judgment, but it also includes the laws that are intelligible. There are chukim, laws that it's very hard to find a human rationale for, but that's not true of the mishpatim. And mishpat, therefore, characterizes the nature of the Jewish tradition as a tradition that is something that human beings can understand and can carry forward and can prosecute with their own reason and through the help, obviously, of texts and traditions. And this makes Judaism a tradition of law, a proud, self-evident tradition of law. God says, what I have in this world are the 4 cubits of the halacha, that's where God dwells, is inside the actions of human beings in a certain sense. and that grand declarations in Judaism don't necessarily have any greater sway than the specifics by which you carry them out, which I think, to be honest, is the reality of the world as we know it, which is that declarations are fine, but if they don't actually find their way into the world, they're somewhat empty. And so this is part of my consistent shtick about the notion of love being an enacted emotion and not just an emotion. That you don't love somebody if you just say you love them. You love them if you act lovingly towards them. Just like to say you're compassionate towards someone, you don't act compassionately, doesn't track. And Judaism is an attempt to reify, to make manifest in people's lives the emotional content of the Torah. And what does it mean to see another human being in the image of God? Well, what it means is not just that you feel it, but that you treat them this way and you don't treat them that way. So that's why law is so indispensable, not just as a guide, but also as a concretization of the principles that the society holds close and holds near. And there you have it. So, okay, how much Roman law, Jerry asked, influenced Jewish law? There is actually, I have a book by Boaz Cohen on Roman law and Jewish law. There is some influence. I don't know. I mean, I would have to be more, I would have to have more expertise in Roman law than I do to say what the influence was. And I also know that there was a very famous article by Rabbi Theodore Friedman, who wrote that the relatively low position of women in Roman society influenced Judaism also, because the position of women in rabbinic literature is in some ways less exalted than the position of women in biblical literature, and he blames that on the influence of Rome. So the extent to which other Roman things influenced Judaism, there are some Greek legal terms in the Talmud, like pros bull and others, and I think Greek and Roman law did have an influence on Jewish law, although, as I said, it would require a more legally adept mind than my own to tease those out. But maybe I'll take a quick look through Boaz Cohen in the next week, if I get a chance to get over to my office and look through that book, and I'll be able to report in more detail. And with that, I hope you have a good and a peaceful and a calm and a healthy week. And I look forward to seeing you, those of you who are on Clubhouse and Clubhouse Torah on tonight at 6:00, and others, Shabbat morning. Take care.